Hi, my name's Dan. This video is one of the series of videos I'm doing on designing enemies for video games, and is one of a larger suite of videos that are about game design, and all sorts of topics within game design. So in this one, I'm going to talk about, well, it's been titled Necessary Information. I'm going to talk about what sort of information do you need to make decisions on when you're designing enemies for video games. And the design of enemies and the design of NPCs or other characters does overlap considerably, and depending on your game, they may effectively be the same thing anyway. Um, the the needs of what you need to create obviously will depend on your game and the situation that you've got. Um, but I'm going to throw out some stuff to think about, and the point here is that when you're creating the suite of enemies for your game, you will probably want information of this type for every enemy or enemy type within the game. So the first one is whether it's instanced or unique. I talked about that in the previous video, but this is the question of whether there are multiple instances of the same enemy, or whether it's a singleton, which is usually the case when it's bosses, and when it's grunts, it's usually instanced. Um, so that's a basic question. If you've got a health system, a combat system that's based on hit points or some health measure, then you're going to need that for your enemies. And it may be a fixed amount for an enemy type, or it may be within certain bounds. Um, and you're probably going to need some other form of stats. Um, I guess there's an assumption that enemies are going to be involved in combat, and there's an assumption that combat involves some kind of strengths and weaknesses, and that's based on some form of stat. Um, Often these are things like strength, agility, etc. But again, it depends on the nature of your combat system as to what actual stats you're going to need. Um, and there's always a thing about stats and numbers in games and game design, which is that the absolute value in isolation isn't necessarily that meaningful. It's only once you get it in relation to the other variables that it starts to make sense. So if I say that an enemy's got a strength of 10, for example, then you don't have a concept of what that means unless you know, first of all, how that strength affects things in combat. So, does it affect how much damage they can do when they hit something? And then, even once you know that, you need to know the context of how many hit points that might be the damage is going to be taken off. So, in this case, that'll be how many hit points the player might have. Um, so it's possible to have sets of numbers that are quite low, and other sets of numbers that, where the numbers are all in their thousands, and they're effectively, the gameplay is exactly the same or very close to the same, and it's just been scaled up. Whenever you start deciding numbers in your game, you need to bear this in mind, that numbers are only ever actually meaningful when they're taken in context of the rest of the game design. You might want some variation in your enemies. You might not. Again, this depends on the game and the type of game that you've got. RPGs typically will have an enemy type and will have variations of strengths and weaknesses within that. So there's some randomization in there. Uh, some games there's no change at all. So for some reason into my head, Mario games have come, and the Goombas, and they're always exactly the same, basically, unless they're classed as a different type or a variation. Every Goomba you face will be exactly the same as the last Goomba that you faced. And this is legitimate. It depends on the nature of your game as to which route you want to go down. Um, you may need some kind of AI information. In fact, you probably do need some information about how your enemy is going to behave, how they're going to attack, what their tactics are, um, and how they're going to go about, yeah, how they're going to go about trying to kill the player. And there is a video later in this series where I'll focus in on this aspect more. But you will need to, as a designer, you would need to provide that information for the developers so that they know how to build that in. Um, there will be at some point either the concept of how this enemy will spawn and what conditions they need to spawn and what chance there is of them spawning, or in most games it's more likely that they've got a location that they start at. So this one's slightly different from the other bits of information in that um, in that for most of them, if you've got an instanced enemy, then you only need to create the information once. You might have variations in there, as I said for the stats, but you'd specify what that variation is, and then leave it up to the program to deal with the specifics of that. But you tend not to leave it up to the program if you're locating enemies, placing them in location, then you're going to need to specify the locations. And so the locations will be per instance here rather than for the whole class of enemy. Um, and alongside that, you'll need the information on whether it respawns or not. That I think is I I, I feel like sometimes I say some quite sweeping statements, and I tend to be trying to check them in my mind as I'm saying them to see whether this is true or not. I was just about to say, I think this is only relevant for enemies that you have specified a location for, and the enemies that are randomly spawned don't need the concept of a respawn because that's actually built into the fact that they spawn. And I think I'm safe in saying that. Drops and rewards. So when the enemy is killed, what happens, or what does the player gain as a result of that? Um, and there is another video coming up later in the series which will deal with this, so I will skip over that. And then I guess the question is any more. I couldn't think of any more that are incredibly common, but it depends on the nature of your game again. Uh, and I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but if you've got a game in which, for example, uh, most of the enemies can either be fought or can be negotiated with, then you would need information about that negotiation and how they deal with it. If there's any special kind of weird and clever and presumably interesting combat that you've got, that might need specific bits of information. Uh, so, one pretty general, pretty common approach to dealing with creating enemies is to create some sort of template, which gives you the outline of the information that you're wanting to have for the enemies. It often will include a picture. I've just put a screenshot in here from a game because my concept art is so rubbish. I wouldn't want to expose the world to it. And I've just thrown this together in Excel, and that could be one way of doing it. It would also be possible to do it in Word or another word processor. It'd be possible to create uh, like a form template in a word processor and print it out and do it by hand if you wanted to. And that you might want that, especially if you wanted to draw your concept art straight on, some idea of what the enemies looks like. And for this particular game that I just kind of threw in off the top of my head, to show an example, um, I've got various pieces of information that I'm looking for. I haven't put location information in here for this because this is a random spawning um, enemy. So down on the bottom left, we've got the name. I've actually got name, family, and type. So I've got categories within categories here, and I'll talk about a thing called taxonomies in the next video after this one. I've written down the fact that it's instanced, And then we've got the stats a little bit to the right from there. So the hit points, I've written this as in dice notation. So this is a notation that's often used uh, in game design, but it comes from pen and paper dice rolling RPGs. And so 10d10 means take 10-sided dice and roll them and add together all the results. And similarly, strength d2 plus 10 means roll a two-sided dice, which effectively is a coin, and add the result to 10. So actually, your variation is small there. You're only going to get 11 or 12 as a choice there. You've got a fixed defense and a fixed speed. And then over on the right hand side, we've got stuff that's written out a bit more. We've got strengths and weaknesses. So I've imagined in this game that there's going to be various different types of damage. So this bog wraith is particularly resistant to physical damage, and that's because they're only semi-solid. They're slightly kind of I was going to say transparent. What's the word for it? Where stuff can pass through. Insubstantial. They're not entirely substantial, but they are unholy. So you get 150% from holy damage. So anything that would do holy damage to them, yeah, you get the idea. Can't be mind controlled. And then as part of the AI actually really is that it'll chase the player but not leave the swamp. That probably should have been put under the tactics in reflection. It's tactics. It fires energy balls that do 10 damage when it's got line of sight every 1.5 to 2.5 seconds. So it's got some random variation in that. And it'll try and circle the player slowly, which is going to be slightly disconcerting for the player. And then when you kill it, it explodes. So it'll do damage. So it's best to deal with these things at a distance. They're trying to deal with you at a distance, and they're gonna. It doesn't say. I would probably guess they might back off if you try and get close to them. So that should have been in the tactics as well, if that's what I'm thinking. And then the spawn chance here. Actually, they're going to spawn near the player, and this is based on moving through the swamp. So as you move through the swamp into, you kind of think new places, but not necessarily. For every second you're moving, there's a 3% chance that one of these will spawn. And it maybe would have been better to have specified if you could have more than one at once. You probably can. It might cause difficulties if you get lots of them. And that number of 3% would have to be tweaked. I've basically thought so. If you get them 3% for every second of movement, that means you're going to get well, if you for every 100 seconds you move, you're actually moving through swamp, you'll get three. And they spawn quite strangely in that they emerge out of the swamp, and their spawn location is relative to the player. So they're in front of the player wherever the player's kind of heading, and they kind of emerge out of the swamp. And in my mind, they rise out of the swamp. So I should have written that in there. So that's a bit of a run through of some of the details that you might need for when you're creating enemies for video games and for your own game design exercises. I find a lot when I'm teaching students that there seem to be two broad types of students when it comes to the creative content of games. There are those who are good at overview and have got lots of imagination, and throw a whole lot of interesting ideas in, and often their game design documents that they create are very text based, and they like doing the story and the kind of background concept of the characters and of the enemies as well. Um, and then the other type of student are those who are really good at detail. And so this sort of template approach is the sort of thing that they will revel in, and they will produce lots of templates, lots of details for lots of different enemies. But maybe the strength that their overviews and their imagination is less good. I find it's quite rare to find students who are really good at both of those things, and that seems to be a key thing for good game designers to be able to do both overviews and high imagination, but also be able to follow that through to the details, which is why I thought it was worthwhile running through what the sort of details might be when you're creating enemies. Anyway, um, I wanted to finish off with one thought, which is this is a picture from one of the Magic the Gathering games, which is that this approach of using a template, it strikes me that it's actually quite similar to producing trading cards or producing any kind of collectible card system. And if you think about your enemies as a card, then that can help you uh, approach this potentially if you're not quite getting your head around this idea of creating a template and putting in the details. And if you want inspiration for enemies, obviously you can look at things like Magic the Gathering because there's a huge plethora of interesting enemies and interesting variations in enemies in World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft, why did I say that? In Magic the Gathering, they're both Wizards of the Coast. No, they're not. I am now tripping over myself in what I'm saying, so I'm going to say that's it from me for now.